177. He prohibited us from eating things that swarm, which come to exist from rot, even though they are not a specific type, do not come into existence from a male and a female. And that is his saying, you shall not make yourself impure through any swarming thing that creeps, etc. The language of the Sifra is, you shall not make yourself impure through any swarming thing that creeps upon the earth, even if it is not fruitful and does not multiply. And that is the difference between his saying that creeps on the earth and that swarms on the earth, as that which swarms refers to that which has the power to give birth to a similar thing. That which creeps refers to that which comes into existence from rot, and one who eats them is lashed. So essentially, this is spontaneous generation of insects. I think a lot of people think he's talking about something like maggots, which were believed to be spontaneously generated. And he's quoting from the Medrash, and he is quoting from, so he's quoting from the Medrash, but the very fact that he's writing this shows that he also accepts this notion of spontaneous generation in insects. Now, there is no practical problem here, because he's saying here that it's forbidden to eat them. If he would have said it's permitted to eat them because they're spontaneously generated, that would be a halachic problem, because then, they're permitting something based on science that is no longer considered proper science, permitting something that should otherwise be forbidden. But that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is he is forbidding something that should be forbidden. In other words, because if it was biologically generated, it for sure would have been forbidden. You might think that since it's spontaneously generated, it isn't. Therefore, the Torah has to tell you that even if it's spontaneously generated, it's forbidden. Now, just to be clear, the Torah does not speak about spontaneous generation. It doesn't speak about it. This is the halachic medrash telling you that this is the reason for the repetition of these phrases. The repetition of very similar phrases is accounted for because one is talking about biologically generated insects and the other one's talking about spontaneously generated insects. But just to be clear, this is Midrash that's saying it. It's not the Torah, not the actual language of the 5 books of the Torah. So this subject comes up in lots of discussion, some of it heated, which is what to do when it appears that the sages are relying on what today is no longer to believed to be proper science. So here is an article from the OU, outorah.org, and it's written by Rabbi Jack Abramowitz. He's often the one writing in these, and we've read a lot of them. Okay, do not contaminate yourself through any creeping thing that moves on the earth. Leviticus 11:44. This mitzvah is potentially troubling. It didn't bother the Rambam, and it didn't bother the Sefer HaChinuch, which is written after the Rambam in the 1200s, but it might bother some of us a great deal. It need not, but in other words, don't worry about it. Let's start with what the Rambam says in his Sefer HaMitzvahs 177 negative, which is our thing. So the 177th negative mitzvah is the warning against eating creeping things that breed from decay, even though they are not of distinct species and they are not bred from a male and a female. This kind of supports the discredited theory of spontaneous generation. The Sefer HaChinuch quotes the Rambam without question, which is hardly surprising since he lived in the 13th century. More surprising is that the Chavetz Chaim also uses this language in the Sefer HaMitzvos HaKatzar, which was published in 1931. So the fact that early scholars are talking about it from like the 12th and 13th centuries are mentioning it. They were living in a time where that was the accepted science of the day. It was more surprising that the Chavetz Chaim adhered to it. Anyways, so what's going on? It would be easy to say that the Rambam simply got this one wrong. But there are two problems with this approach. That would leave us with 612 in his count, and it would be incredibly arrogant for us to second guess the Rambam. He wrote the Mishnah Torah, Perush HaMishnayos, and Moreh Nevuchim. When anyone reading this can write, and when anyone reading this can write any of those things, then we can talk about the possibility of second guessing the Rambam. So, point number one is, if he got this wrong, that now we need a filler. That's not the end of the world. If the Rambam got this wrong, it would just mean in the Rambam's book, he only mentions 612, and now we could guess what should replace it. His second problem is that, who are you to question the Rambam? The thing is, you're not second guessing the Rambam. The Rambam wrote what he wrote, and you're not second guessing the Rambam. The world of science has moved on from the science of his day. So the burden shouldn't be on you. You're not second guessing him. The science moved on from it. Anyways, what do we do about this? So how are we to understand this mitzvah when it so blatantly flies in the face of our understanding of nature? It may be an oversimplification of the issue, but for our purposes, it is safe to say that the what is correct, even though the why is an error. Again, like I was mentioning, bottom line is the result is correct. Eating those bugs is forbidden by the Torah. But not for the reason you're saying. That's all. But the end result is you got to the right result. You just didn't get there with the correct reasoning. So this is going to be the approach to this and other statements of Chazal that are like this, that in any of the cases where the result is the same as it would be with the present knowledge of science. So in that case, you would say the what is right, it's just the why. In other words, but the end result is not in question, it's just how we got there. This is not an unprecedented approach. The Talmud states that lice may be killed on Shabbos because they spontaneously generate. Now, that's an example of the one I told you would be a problem, because here they're permitting something that should be forbidden. If the lice are not spontaneously generated, then it should be forbidden to kill them. They are a living entity, and it's forbidden to kill living entities on Shabbos. They're permitting you to kill these lice because they're spontaneously generated. So that really should be a problem. So Rav Eliyahu Dessler, author of Mitam Eliyahu, addresses this issue, and he said that the reasons attached to the halacha are only speculative. In this case, the sages assume that the reason lice may be killed is because they spontaneously generate. But if the reason is disproved, the halacha is unaffected. Now, why would that be? Why would the halacha be unaffected? Because what Rav Dessler seems to be saying is they already know it's permitted to kill those. They just assumed that this was the reason. but they know the end result that's supposed to be. That's what he's suggesting. The end result is supposed to be that you can kill those lice. They know that. They just thought the reason was because of this science, but they might be wrong about that. The reason isn't because of that science, but they got to the right result. Indeed, the Talmud Yerushalmi also permits lice to be killed on Shabbos, but it never suggests the reason of spontaneous generation. Seer Moshe Feinstein, who also ruled that a change in nature, a change in our understanding of nature, does not affect halacha. This is just one approach to dealing with such questions. A full analysis is beyond our scope. This gets lots of treatment, this subject, but that seems to be the approach, which is even though we have a change in our understanding of nature, and they're mentioning that it's that understanding of nature that they had, which is now changed, that led them to the halachic conclusion. We still follow the halachic conclusion, even though the basis for that halachic conclusion now seems to be mistaken. And then you'd have to see why that is. So Rav Dessler gave his explanation. Nevertheless, we are left to explain this mitzvah, namely not eating a creeping thing that moves on the earth. Spontaneous generation or not, the Torah just draws a distinction between creepy things that crawl on the ground and creepy things that move on the earth. Both are prohibited, regardless of the scientific realities of the parentage. It's entirely possible that the distinction between these two categories is the visibility of the creature's eggs. As we mentioned in the previous mitzvah, things that cannot be seen with the naked eye are generally not problematic. This verse may prohibit visible insects whose eggs cannot be seen for 3,156 years from the giving of the Torah in the Hebrew year 2448 until the proof of Louis Pasteur. It would have been reasonable for people to assume that such creatures were spontaneously generated. But Louis, that's why he's surprised about the Chavetz Chaim, because Pasteur had already demonstrated that there isn't spontaneous generation in 1864, and he's writing he's writing Mishnah Brura 50 years after that. In any event, the Torah itself never mentions spontaneous generation. In fact, in the aforementioned Talmud, the sage Abai states outright that lice do not spontaneously generate, citing a dictum that specifically refers to lice eggs. That position is dismissed on the assumption that it must refer to another species of insect, but you can see this was never a one-sided issue. Spontaneous generation is not and never was a tenet of our faith. Okay, that is that. And now just one other. That was called Talking About My Spontaneous Generation. Talking about my generation. All right, now we are going to look at an article from Jewish Action, but only a part of it. This is from an interview with Rabbi Herschel Schechter, who's the Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University. And this was in Jewish Action magazine, which is a periodical associated with the OU. So if halacha is determined according to Talmudic science and contemporary science, if halacha is determined according to Talmudic science, and contemporary science disagrees, should the halacha change? Rabbi Herschel Schechter, Shlita, a great-grandson of the Chassam Sofer, who is the rabbi of Klausenberg, Rav Moshe Shmuel Glasner, wrote a commentary on Chulin called Dor Revi'i. So he would be fourth generation for the Chassam Sofer. That's why he's calling it Dor Revi'i, means fourth generation. His introduction to the Sefer is really an introduction to the entire Torah Shabbal path, the oral Torah. He discusses this issue, which the Ramban raises. The first Mishnah in Horayos says that if the Beis Din Hagadol, the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, rules incorrectly, and you know it is wrong, you're not allowed to follow that ruling. However, Rashi and Chumash quotes the Sifrei, who states that you have to follow the Sanhedrin, even if they may mistakenly say that right is left. How does one deal with this contradiction? Again, in the first Mishnah in Horius, it says that if you know the Sanhedrin is wrong, then you're not allowed to follow their ruling. On the other hand, Rashi's quoting the Sifrei, the halachic medrash, which says that you must follow their ruling, even if you know it to be wrong, even if they tell you that what you know to be left, what you know to be right is left, you still have to do it. The Dor Revi'i thinks that the answer is the following. If the rabbis made a mistake regarding scientific information, but in their generation it was accepted as correct science, then the ruling is binding, even though we live in a later generation and we know that the science is incorrect. But if even in their generation the science was known to be incorrect, then the ruling is not accepted. I don't think this approach makes sense. Wrong is wrong. I think we have to follow the approach of the Tanoim and the Amoraim. They followed the latest scientific developments in their time. Similarly, in every generation, we have an obligation to follow the scientific consensus. Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik once said at a Chag HaSmicha, this was a holiday when they were giving at the yeshiva, they had a special feast where they were giving out smicha, that we shouldn't rush to change the halacha because scientists can't change their minds. Halacha needs to be around for a long time. But if many years pass and something is accepted as a scientific fact which contradicts halacha, then we need to reconsider the halacha. Maybe the halacha was established even if that scientific reality is not correct. While the Talmud seems to say that one may kill lice on Shabbos because they do not reproduce but generate spontaneously, Ramosha Tendler frequently says the spontaneous generation is not an underlying principle of this halacha. Lice reproduce differently. That is what the Gemara means. That is why there's no prohibition to kill lice on Shabbos. Similarly, regarding worms and fish, the Gemara says they are kosher because they were generated in the fish. We know that they come from outside the fish. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach explains that this means that the worms were not visible to the naked eye until they grew in the fish, and that is considered to be as if they were generated in the fish. But if there's a halacha that is clearly based on a scientific mistake, that you cannot interpret, and you can't interpret it differently, it's outright incorrect. How can you continue observing it? It's based on a mistake. We believe in Torah Min HaShamayim. It's a divine code. If there is a mistake, it's a man-made mistake. HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't make mistakes. So that was Rav David Bashevkin who was interviewing him. So I don't know. What he doesn't do here is he doesn't list an example of one where it really should be changed. And he also doesn't talk about what the process would be to change it. Could any individual just decide that they're no longer going to follow the law? Does it require a Sanhedrin to do it? So he doesn't talk about that, but that's the beginning of this literature. This stuff got very hot, and there's a lot of almost vitriolic academic literature out there.
But Rabbi, where are we if you're saying that if something scientifically has been proven and it's against, and halacha is not what the science shows, where are we?
So it seems like it depends on the specific one. If you can show that the halacha was not actually based on the science, that the science of the time is something they're mentioning, but it's not the only reason they're saying that particular thing, then you would continue to follow the halacha, even though the science is wrong, because they weren't wholly basing it on the science. So, for instance, let's say that they knew the end result, that lice was permitted to kill on Shabbos. They assumed that the reason was the science of the day. Then the science of the day is disproven. So it doesn't change the fact that they already had a tradition that lice are permitted to kill. It just means that their assumption of what it was based on is wrong. So, so he was saying, so those kind of things, you would continue to follow them. But and so you would also eat the worms and fish, which is what we were talking about the other days. You'd eat the worms and fish because we're told halachically you can eat the worms and fish, and it seems like from the Gemara that the reason you can do that is because they were assumed to be spontaneously generated inside the fish. So now we know they are not spontaneously generating the fish; they come from the outside. But uh, but since what you could say is that even if they aren't spontaneously generating the fish, it would still be permitted, because since they started in a in a circumstance that was not visible to the naked eye, and they grow inside the fish, they're considered to be fish and not a separate entity. And so Rabbi Schachter was saying, if that's what's going on, that you have a law, you already know the result, and they're just making a mistake on what the reason for that result is, then you would continue to keep that halacha. But if there's a halacha that's entirely based on mistaken science, then you have to challenge that halacha. If there's no other explanation, and you're not saying they knew the end result, you're saying that they came to this conclusion solely based on their understanding of nature at that time. And now our understanding of nature has changed, and we know that previous information to be wrong, then you need to reconsider the halacha. But he didn't give any examples of that, what that would be, if there are any halachos like that. But yeah. All right. I am grateful that we got to study together. And we are not meeting the women's class is not meeting
Right.
tomorrow. And our Rambam class will meet again on Monday. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. Rabbi,
right.
just
Yeah.
one thing. I thought what you had said was if they had mistaken, if they had mistaken science, they believed something, then you keep following it. But if they knew the science and still said something, said the opposite, then you don't follow.
He quoted that. That was from that book, Dor Revi'i. He
Oh.
quoted it, and then he said he thinks it's incorrect. He strongly
Right.
disagrees with his conclusion, because the way it works is, according to the Dor Revi'i, you would continue to follow a halacha even if it was solely based on a misunderstanding of nature, and that he can't abide by. He was saying, no, if there's a halacha that is solely based on a misunderstanding of science, then he thinks you need to take another look at the halacha.
Yeah,
that would be the difference between him and the other guy. The other one, the Dor Revi'i, would say it doesn't matter, even if it's solely based on it. You must continue to follow it, because it was consistent with the science of their day.
No, that I saw. I thought we were saying something like that, like Chazal knew something.
No,
and
some
they
things.
ruled the
No,
opposite
not
way.
all cases, but if in some of those cases it looks like that was what was going on, but you'd have to see from context if it looks like that's what's going on.
Oh,
Like
oh.
the way he showed it is because the Yerushalmi never mentioned spontaneous generation. The Gemara, even the Bavli, he said, did not directly mention spontaneous generation. So, with regard to the lice on Shabbos, so, so it's their understanding is, at least this leaves room for the fact that they knew it to be permitted, and it's just that others are speculating based on the science of the day that that's why. So if you could learn it that way, if there's room to learn it that way, then you would not change the halacha. But if he doesn't, let's say the meat and the fish thing, for instance, let's say meat and fish, a combination of meat and fish, no longer seems to be dangerous. Whereas it seems like that was the reason that it was forbidden originally. It was forbidden originally because it's dangerous.
Right.
So like even the Noda B'Yehuda, like I think he's writing in the early 1800s or late 1700s. I think he's writing in the late 1700s. The Noda B'Yehuda acknowledges that, but he said that we don't have you need to have a Sanhedrin to change it. Now, the reason he's saying that though might be because he's assuming that we either don't have those fish anymore that they were worried about, or he's not assuming the science is mistaken.
Right.
He's just assuming that nature changed or something. But what if it was based completely on mistaken science and there's no other explanation, and you can't give one of these things where they know it's permitted from some other place? So then what? So that's my only question in the aftermath of that interview is I would have two more questions, which is how would you change it? And then the other question is, can you give us examples?
Right. What would you change?
Right.
This is interesting. Just 1 minute. David and I were having a discussion the other day about what knowledge is.
Yeah.
And it's described by philosophers as justified true belief. And this is so funny because you could have something like we're discussing now. They knew it was correct, but they didn't know the real reason for it.
So now, so retroactively, does it no longer?
No.
It's no longer knowledge because it was an incorrect fact.
It's not what we describe as knowledge. But
right.
you believed correctly. You believed something true, but you justified it for the wrong reason. It was just,
What? Oh, wait. So you're saying that according to that, since it was true when in their time, it continues to be true today?
No,
is it still knowledge today?
I'm just saying about what we consider knowledge is. Yes, you had a true belief, but it wasn't real knowledge because it wasn't justified by the correct thing that see.
All right, I have a halachic question.
Oh,
the halachic question is, I am about to learn this halacha in the Rambam. Do I make Birkas HaTorah before studying this halacha in the Rambam? If is it Torah or is it not Torah? If it's a result based on a disproven fact, was it Torah to discuss to learn this or not? And would I make a bracha before
I would say, according to some philosophers, no, and according to those who don't believe that knowledge is only justified true belief, then yes, it could be. It's still true belief.
Yeah, but there's.
Well, what if you're just reading the justification?
Yeah.
Rabbi, what's interesting is that a lot of things in science that are proven don't stand the test of time. There are very few things that stand the test of time. So if you come up with something that would go against halacha, you know, the question is, you said, do you make a change in halacha? I wouldn't do anything for 50.
That's how he starts off this.
I wouldn't do anything for 50 to 100 years, because
Right.
in 50 to 100 years,
Right.
you'll probably
That's what,
find out that the science thing was not true anyway.
right. That's how either him or Jack Abramowitz, that's how they started off. They said, first of all, you gotta wait a while just to let the dust settle and see if that's agreed upon. But by now it's been 150 years since then, and it seems to be agreed upon by everybody, you know. But again, you're right. It could be in a couple hundred years or in 1 year, suddenly they would have to reconsider that. So yes, that is
Yeah.
definitely
Sam,
a
that's
warning,
right.
an important
That's-
warning. Yeah,
Well, that's why low plug rabbanim. You just, right,
right. You know.
right. Yeah.
Yeah,
All
not
righty.
Rabbi.
All right. Be well, guys.
Thank you. Thank you,
Okay.
Rabbi.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.